First of all, let me just say it was incredibly sad to hear about the passing away of Delano. And it's a reminder to all of us that motorsport is inherently dangerous. I will vehemently denounce anyone who ever says that racing is too safe nowadays. Any machine constructed by human hands can be destroyed along with the life that happens to be in it. Formula One, it's almost like you get into a relationship with someone and you have this perception of who you are, and they like who you are, and you go on a date and everything is going well. And then over time, when you spend more time with them, you find out they're not like that at all. That's not you met a fictitious person. You didn't actually meet the person. And so if a person, loves you, or if you love a sport, you love what it actually is. We have to give credit where it's due. As I said several times, it's not enough to have a fast car to deliver dominant performances. You need the driver to unlock those performances to actually pull the maximum out of the car. That's why I think retrospectively Lewis was not given enough credit for his eras of dominance in the Mercedes. Everyone just said, "Oh, you just have the fastest car, you'll win by a mile every time." That's nonsense. It was nonsense then, it's nonsense now. And I think that's also evidenced in the way we see the RB19 being performed in Max's hands versus Checo's hands.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the F1 Hour. Today with me, an esteemed colleague, my right honourable friend, Mr. Bryson Sullivan. How are we doing, sir?
Good, very good. Good to be back.
Good man. Good to have you back on. Again, the first member, the first guest even, get your words correct, Cameron, of the F1 Hour. Put some respect on Bryson Sullivan's name. Can we talk about some F1, Bryson? Because I'm struggling a little bit today. Like, I thought that the Austrian Grand Prix was a little bit of a damp squid, up and downs. Okay, so there was some interesting plot lines down the track. But then today, it feels like the news story has been Toto will failing to put some respect on Lewis Hamilton's name via a pit radio message where obviously Lewis was complaining. He was talking about the track limits infringement of the guys in front of him. He was also complaining about the car not being where he wanted it to be, to which Toto Wolff, Mercedes team principal, responded, "Lewis, we know the car's not very good. Please just drive it." To that, Mr. Sullivan, you react how, sir?
I don't really care. I know the irony of all of this is that I'm supposed to care tremendously about some sort of grievous assault against Lewis Hamilton's honor and all of this. But to be honest, I think Lewis kind of his experience and his accomplishments speak for themselves. I can understand the sentiment that you could have more respect for someone with that kind of caliber, but I'm not going to say anything about their specific relationship. I think specifically the way that they interact is complex, right? Toto knows who Lewis is and what he means to their team and what he means to the brand. And Lewis knows what he brings to the table as far as being the caliber of driver that he is, not only on the track itself, but developing the car and all the things that he brings with him. I mean, it was a difficult weekend for everyone. I think that Lewis was also in a situation where he wasn't feeling comfortable with the car. Obviously, there were some setup changes that he made between Saturday and Sunday that made the car almost undrivable. He was basically full steering lock in turn 10 and still steering wide so many times and exacerbating the track limits issues that we can definitely talk about as well. But I think when you have a weekend like that, arguably, I mean, the worst weekend of the season so far for Mercedes, if you discount Bahrain with the very first race. And honestly, things are going to be said during that situation that people are going to be somewhat upset about. I wouldn't really put too much stock in it. My focus would actually be on the next race, given that almost all the teams are based in the UK and given that Silverstone is the next race, we're going to see a ton of upgrades on all the cars. And it's a very good opportunity to turn things around and have a good weekend. So as far as I'm concerned, go on to the next one.
See, this is why Mr. Sullivan gets paid the big bucks for being a god tier level diplomat and the highest level of pragmatist. Cameron F1, on the other hand, Bryson, I don't get paid the big bucks like that because I don't have the requisite skills. Bryson, as I read and digest it, the more that I listen to the radio messages between the two, I'm like, that's not it, Toto. I don't think that's it. And here's why I don't think that's it. Because Lewis, for the most part, okay, so people will always criticize Lewis for being a whiner, right? Cry Morton, as the naysayers like to call him. And I don't think that's Lewis will moan with the best of them, but they all moan on the grid, right? For any which one of them, Verstappen, Leclerc, when there's something to moan about, Lando, when there's something to moan about, each and every single one of those 20 drivers on that grid will have a cheeky moan. But credit where credit is due, Bryson, because for the most part, Lewis has found himself in a really, really bad situation on the back of an off season where he told the team that the design philosophy wasn't that they were barking up the wrong tree, changing design philosophy. They didn't listen to him. And Lewis, for the most part, has been saintly in the level of patience that he's shown, right? Minimal moaning, and he has every right to moan. So the one time when he kind of like, and he wasn't effing and blinding, he was just having a cheeky moan. So the one time that he has a little bit, he loses his rag just a little bit, excessive moaning, just a little bit, indulge the 7-time champion Toto Wolff. You were the team principal. You have one of the goatiest goats that's ever goated in your car. Indulge him, surely, Toto. I don't know something that I'm missing here, Bryson. Because
I don't think you're missing anything per se. I just think that one of the things that's always been odd to me to begin with is actually the way that Lewis is treated differently than other drivers. I mean, we know that's sort of a fact, and many people make it their entire personality to be upset and to be, I don't want to say combative on the radio, but it's just a part of how they are. I also think it's a little bit weird that the team principals are on the radio most of the time anyway. Like the only time when a team principal really needs to be on the radio is when your two drivers are battling it out for the lead of the race. They're about to crash into each other, multi-21 step situation, and the team principal comes on and says, "Hey, calm down with that." Basically, read them the riot act. Beyond that, it just seemed a little bit unnecessary. But as I said, I could leave the debates and arguments about that to others. But there's no question in my mind that Lewis is held to a different standard than other drivers are. Perhaps because people just don't like him in general, and the opportunity to criticize him or bring him down is a little bit too enticing for them to pass on. But that's always going to be that way. These people are always going to be out there, and so I would just focus on the next race.
Oh, Bryson, I love that, man, and he's the elder statesman on the grid now, so I kind of get the higher state of accountability. I understand that from the external third parties, right? The commentators, broadcasters, F1 Twitter geniuses. Cool, get it. But this is Toto that we're talking about, Bryson. Toto's meant to be. Anyway, let me not get. I could go off on Toto for the next 60 minutes.
The last thing I'll say about this, because there is something to say here, is that team principals. The primary job function of a team principal is to protect the team and to promote the team. It is not to be honest. It is not to be fair. Sometimes it's not to do any of the things we would normally associate with normal human beings. So my default position regarding anything team principals say in press and things is to not really believe them as a general rule, only because we know what their job function is and what they're trying to do. I'm sure they're all very nice people in their own way, but they aren't really the people that I put the most stock in terms of who I'm listening to on a constant basis. I listen more to engineers typically.
Yeah, you'll get more truth out of them. I hear that, but then, Bryson, but that makes me think even then, that makes it even worse. Because if you can be liberal with the truth and you understand that your key stakeholder as Mercedes-Benz team principal is Lewis Hamilton, then you understand all too well that the eyes and ears of the world will be on that radio message. So why subordinate your key stakeholder in Lewis Hamilton at a time when he's most vulnerable, right? He must be thinking, I should have just sat this off and retired. Yeah, I tell you what, Bryson, in closing on this, as soon as I heard the message, and there's broader context, when you hear the broadcast that they put out on the internationally syndicated broadcast, it felt more egregious, right? Because Lewis was moaning about both the car and track limits. If you just pay attention to what they said on the broadcast, he sounded like he was just talking about track limits. So it didn't really match what Toto's response. But I will say this, Bryson, my knee-jerk reaction to it was the famous incident with LeBron a couple of years back. You know, when that broadcaster said, "Shut up and dribble." Mm-hmm. It almost felt like a mirror image of. I was like, really, Toto? Is this where we're at? No, I don't know. I think
No,
Mr.
I think that's fair. I think that's definitely a fair parallel to draw in terms of hearing it, the way it sounds. And
Yeah,
as I said before, I'll let them work it up between themselves, but I can't get upset on behalf of someone else
I
when
love that.
they feel it. I mean, if I was going to be upset on Lewis's behalf, I'd be more upset about his incident with Max into turn one in qualifying on Saturday, which just seemed such a strange thing to happen. And Lewis was very chill about it. He was just like, "Yes, we had a poor timing in that situation, and that was what really precipitated that." But he just moved on to the next thing, and it
Go,
seemed like his style.
so go on then. Let's talk about that. It's interesting then that Lewis can kind of. I almost think he has not the measure of Max, but he understands Max for who he is, right? Like Max has shown him on a gazillion occasions that he's super aggressive, no quarter given ever. And so I think Lewis has got this thing with Max where he's kind of like the enemy beyond the walls, right? So he's going to treat me a certain way, and I'm going to treat him this way, and that's what it is, and that's what it will always be. But bloody Toto, I don't know. And I suppose to your point, Bryson, that the the saintly, the God level patience that Lewis has shown up until this point is in clear view, right? Because of the fact that he just didn't really care about the match. He was like, that's just Max. But you know that Lewis was upset on the back of the interaction with Toto because he didn't even turn up to the post race debrief, right? He must have been
I'm not sure if that
fuming.
was confirmed. I heard that, but I wasn't sure if it was confirmed.
I've heard it from a couple of different people now, but you're right. It's this is all hearsay. Eh? Oh dear. Go on then. Let's talk about the Austrian Grand Prix. Go on. In fact, you segue very nicely onto the pre-race incident between Lewis and Mr. Verstappen. Talk to me how you characterise that, because I think we might fall on different sides of the fence here, boys.
We probably might not. Honestly, fundamentally, the way I would characterize the situation is Max is a world champion right now, whether people like that or not. But he's not acting like a world champion. He's still acting like someone who doesn't have a championship, who hasn't, you know, raced with high quality drivers for a while. And he finds himself in certain situations where he's very reactionary and very cutthroat in a way that if he thought about it for a little bit more time, he probably would take a different decision. I think of Brazil, last year. This incident with Lewis as well was very strange. And just to be clear, the way that I interpret what's going on is that yes, Lewis was starting his lap at the time when Max was finishing his, and due to some timing, issues with Mercedes, that was closer than it really should have been. But in my view, Lewis already committed to starting his lap. He was already full throttle going through the final corner, starting his lap at the time Max came upon him. It is true that Max was, slowed down by Lewis being there, sort of off put and had to go off of line. But when two cars are both simultaneously on a push lap, you can't actually impede another car. If you look at all the examples of impeding and people being given penalties, that was for situations in which the slower car was not on a hot lap. They were not on a push lap. If there are two drivers that encounter each other and they're both pushing for a lap, they both have equal claim to the racetrack. However, because Max felt that he was hard done by and definitely lost time in the final corner, instead of just saying that's unfortunate, I'll have a talk about this or I'll complain about Lewis on the radio or something, he's decided to take actions into his own hands and make sure that he absolutely prevented Lewis from finishing his lap or even starting his lap rather. And I think the thing that was so odd about that was even though it was a sprint race and it wasn't really a huge deal, that did have knock-on consequences, right? I mean, we can't change the fact that Lewis started from way back in the grid when he should have been, fourth or fifth or something like that to start the race. And arguably, given the experiences that Mercedes had in the sprint race, that probably informed their setup changes, the minor setup changes between Saturday and Sunday. You can change, front wing angle and parc ferme, which is actually what they did on Lewis's car that caused the balance to be so atrocious. It was just understeering like crazy. And so, even though it seemed like that incident didn't really have much of an impact, I would argue that it did actually have kind of a big impact in terms of how the weekend unfolded. But it was a situation where I believe if Max took a slightly less myopic view and a less reactionary view of the situation, he would have just let it go. And as I said, this is a situation where it's time to start acting like a champion in my mind. Max is a very, very good driver. He's gotten a lot better in qualifying. He's always had, great race pace. His wheel to wheel racing is, still pretty atrocious as far as I'm concerned. But he has the ability to drive better than this, and he's just choosing not to.
Oh, Bryson. So here's where we diverge. I think firstly I'm going to point my scopes at the engineers, both Red Bull GP and Bono, right? Because they should be managing. It's their job principally to manage where their drivers are on track at any one time, right? And Lewis should have got it in his ear that, listen, Max is coming up and here's how we handle it or whatever. That incident should have never happened. Those two should have never been fighting for the same piece on the track. So primarily I'm going to put my scopes on the engineers respectively. Secondarily though, Bryson, as a dude who's raced cars and karts, I'm not sure I wouldn't have done the same as Max. It is petty, Bryson. It absolutely is petty. But
as long as you agree that it's petty, we're on the same page.
Absolutely, it is petty. But I tell you what, not everybody. Here's where, and I don't want to do the Lewis Hamilton loving, but here's where I think Lewis is deserving of credit, because he's got this otherworldly ability to turn the other cheek and forgive in real time, right? I've never ever seen any other driver have that. Me especially, Bright. Listen, I'll tell you what. If I'm in Max Verstappen's position and I'm hindered in the latter stage of my hot lap, mate, and you're about to start your own hot lap, I have the opportunity to deliver instant vengeance. Oh, mate, Bryson, I would have done exactly the same thing, potentially worse, because
But as I said, I can understand the situation if the driver has not actually started their hot lap yet. I can understand it. But if you look at the telemetry, especially if you look at both of their onboards, Lewis had already committed to being full throttle at the time when Max came across him. So as I said before, the argument is a little bit more subtle than I think we're mentioning here. Is that yes, it's possible to be impeded by a car going slowly in front of you. The question is that car technically on a hot lap? And my contention is that Lewis actually was at that time.
Oh wow, but he kind of hadn't gone through it, right?
I think he had.
Really?
Yeah. As I said before, the reason why I know this is because when I went back to look at the actual onboards of this, not only did Max have some issues with Lewis in that particular lap, but he was actually chasing Lewis around on his in lap from the previous stint. Like I listened to his radios with GP as well, and to see that's how I know that he was going to go for one hot lap and then recover after the situation that he had with Lewis. But even when Russell passed him, and then he passed Russell, and a few other things happened earlier in the session, and then when Lewis passed him, even when Max was on his in lap, he was like chasing Lewis down at almost racing speeds. I mean, there's something about Lewis's interaction with Verstappen, where Verstappen himself seems to have a switch that turns on when he sees him. And vengeful. I don't think we'll ever fully understand where it comes from or how it will sort of eventually sort of blossom into whatever it becomes. I feel like it may have been born in in Jeddah in 2021. And that particular race with the brake check incident and everything else, I noticed a change in Verstappen's character in that race that might be the cause of this.
He is vengeful, Bryson, but I don't. When he takes it too far, a la Jeddah 21 or a Brazil 21, I don't like that. But the instance that I saw over the weekend, I was like, I see that trait in myself, Bryson. I don't hate it, mate. I would have done, honestly, I would have done, because in my mind, I'm thinking, if I'm Max, I'm thinking, okay, so your engineers should have told you at the very least that I'm coming up behind you. Kick off your hot lap already so that we don't even end up on the same piece of track, right? Or start it a little bit earlier, okay? So you might take a little bit more out the tyres, but ultimately you're going to learn from this now that if this happens again, that this is the way to deal with it, because now everybody's a loser.
Yeah, I think we're all on the same page that Mercedes is the ones that should have gotten Lewis the communication to let him know to not be anywhere near to where Verstappen was. So fundamentally, this all kicked off by what Mercedes did and how they actually got Lewis in that situation, or where his outlet was. But at the end of the day, it started happening, and we all saw what happened.
Oh, so go on then. Finally, on Mercedes, before we get some other topics, I'm losing hope, Bryson. I'm losing hope because I just feel like patience is something that I don't have. I've just spoken to it right, and I feel like we're not progressing, even with everything accounted for. Okay, so wrong design philosophy. We're 18 months behind the rest of them, or 36 if you do the double whammy thing. Um, we've brought some upgrades. They seem to do the trick in Barcelona, but everybody knows that the Mercedes always goes well in Barcelona, and that was a situation that was always going to flatter to deceive. We end up at Austria, and we are like behind Bryson, like materially behind where a team of the ilk of Mercedes should be, in my humble opinion. Bryson, speak to Mercedes fans around the world, and how do you characterize the gap between the outfit from Brackley and Brixworth as versus the race lead at the moment? Because it feels insurmountable, at least before 2026. Talk to me, sir.
No, I don't think it's necessarily that far. I mean, the first thing I would say is if you're in Mercedes camp and you're looking for what to expect from the rest of the season, you should already start your baseline at the championship's gone for this season. The second place is going to be hotly contested between Mercedes and Aston Martin and Ferrari. And as we've seen in the fluctuation in form for all three of those teams, Ferrari had a bad weekend in Barcelona. Aston Martin had a great weekend in Canada. Mercedes had a bad weekend, in Austria. These things are complicated and they will be in flux for the entirety of the season. But the fundamental place where you should start is assume the championships are lost right away. They're already gone. The number one thing you should be focusing on is learning how to develop the car that they currently have and position themselves in an appropriate place to actually fight for wins in 2024. This idea that Red Bull will never be caught for until 2026, I think might be a little bit of a stretch. But in terms of what Mercedes can do, they're not fundamentally fighting for anything in the current season except for understanding. They're fighting to learn how to actually build a car, and they're restricted in that by the mechanical and conceptual limitations of the design that they already abandoned. They can't move the upper side impact structure around. They can't change some fundamental aspects of the car, like their floor design. Even if they wanted to look at those incredible shots of the Red Bull from Monaco, those changes won't actually make it to their own car until maybe Japan or sometime later in the year. And what we've seen for the current season is it's possible to have a good weekend or a bad weekend just based on car setup. I don't think we're appreciating how much of a factor car setup actually has on car performance. If you look at Aston Martin's difficult weekend in Spain, a big part of that was car setup as well, not getting it right for getting the tire temperatures in the correct window. And I also think that if you look at Ferrari in that particular race, they had brought their pretty sizable upgrade to the car, kind of a change in philosophy to a more downwashing side pod design, and they also were having difficulties. But now look at them; now they're having a fantastic weekend, and a huge part of that is due to setup as well as upgrades. So yes, it's true that going into Austria, people actually expected Austria to be a stronger track for Mercedes than Canada was. But that just ended up not really being the case. There could be a number of reasons for that. One of the big ones was the changes to the front wing angle that I mentioned to you previously about where Lewis was. But fundamentally, it demonstrates that these cars are very complicated machines. It's not just, hey, listen, this simulation tells us this piece will make a car 2/10 faster, and you put it on the car, you bolt it on like in Need for Speed or Formula One, 2023 or something, and it just makes the car faster. It just never works that way. And I think the past couple of races have made perfectly clear or re-emphasized how important it is to actually get the setup right. Not to mention the fact that the sprint weekend made it even worse. You could argue that one of the reasons Mercedes was led down this path of keeping with the zero pod for so long was because they had a pretty good weekend in Brazil. They were able to win a race and they had a 1-2. That was kind of the marker for them to continue going forward. But in retrospect, we know that the Red Bull had a very difficult weekend that weekend. They should have been much better than they were. They made they had made ride height changes that were fundamentally putting the car out of the window, and it was a sprint weekend that weekend as well. And so they were effectively locked out of real competition right from the beginning. And I'd argue something similar happened to Mercedes this particular weekend. So I wouldn't give up all hope of them winning a race this year. I still believe they're going to win a race this year. They will, or Aston Martin will, or Ferrari will at some point this year, I suspect. But fundamentally, things change very quickly. As I mentioned before, teams are bringing a lot of big upgrades for Silverstone because it's a proximal race to where they're based. Mercedes being one of them, bringing one of the biggest upgrades of the year, and they're going to have more before the summer break. So fundamentally, yes, people might want them to be higher up than they are, but just things are changing very quickly.
Well said, Bryson. I never forget on our first chat on the F1 Hour, you said something to the effect of F1 teams have to be humble before nature. And I think this is a case in point, right? Not everything works all the time, and you've got to be flexible in your approach. And thank all of the F1 gods that Mercedes have finally abandoned what was ostensibly a very dodgy design philosophy. Before we talk Silverstone, Bryson, I want to ask you a question about Red Bull and the extent of their dominance. Because I was in awe over the weekend when I've always had this question, or for the past couple of races, I've been questioning back and forth whether we've seen the true extent of the RB19 dominance, whether they've shown us all their cards. And I'm starting to think that they haven't, because, Bryson, how surprised were you, quite frankly, for want of a better turn of phrase, the piss take that was Max Verstappen coming in with a couple of laps left for a set of soft compound tyres, red labelled no less, warming up his tyres as if it were quali on the penultimate lap, and then blasting off down the Austrian track, the Austrian GP Spielberg, as if it were a qualifying session. Bryson, what am I missing, sir? Are we seeing the true extent of the RB19's dominance just yet, or have we got that as a surprise to come, mate?
Well, the first thing is we have to give credit where it's due. As I said several times, it's not enough to have a fast car to deliver dominant performances. You need the driver to unlock those performances to actually pull the maximum out of the car. That's why I think retrospectively Lewis was not given enough credit for his eras of dominance in the Mercedes. Everyone just said, "Oh, you just have the fastest car, you'll win by a mile every time." That's nonsense. It was nonsense then. It's nonsense now. And I think that's also evidenced in the way we see the RB19 being performed in Max's hands versus Checo's hands. One thing I will say about that, though, the gap between teammates seems to be particularly wide at the moment. I think there's two sides to that. I think it is true that Max has definitely gone up a level in this particular season and rounded off elements of his performance profile as a driver to make him more formidable. But also, I think we're not seeing the real Checo right now. I think he's definitely having some difficult weekends. Obviously, he had the health issue that kept him from being at the track on Thursday, and I think he's still getting the grips with the pressure of an actual title fight. But I think he's better on average than we're seeing right now. And fundamentally, I think there's more pace to be extracted out of him. But Max is getting it out of the car, and we were asking the question, what is the actual service ceiling, so to speak, of the RB19? And I was reading some articles with Max suggesting he was laughing reading articles claiming that teams were getting closer to him after Canada when the gap was only 10 seconds. And yes, we know he had a bird in his, brake duct and other things, but it wasn't unreasonable to think the cars were getting closer. I think part of it is again down to setup. Red Bull just didn't do a good job with their setup in Canada that allowed other teams to get closer. Also, some other teams just did a very good job. I mean, these things are, we always look at this as just a black and white. Hey, the car's fast today. It's not fast today. It must be garbage in general for every track. And I don't think that's actually the case. I think there's a wide range of variability there based on all kinds of things. What's the wind like? What's the cloud cover like? Did it rain recently? All of these things matter for a performance. And so the actual performance ceiling of the cars is potentially obscured by all of these factors. As far as your key question, have we seen the real pace of the RB19? The only times we've ever gotten hints of it, glimpses of it, are when Sergio Perez is ahead of Max Verstappen and Max is driving behind him, trying to catch up to him. Right, those are the few cases where we've actually seen the real pace. And you could look at Jeddah and you could look at Miami as examples where that was happening. And even then, they still were backing off towards the end because you can have a fist fight, so to speak, between your drivers for supremacy and still not use 100% of the power available in terms of the ERS deployment. So we don't really know. The fact that Max was able to do that was that fastest lap was quite interesting in my view. But here's my final take on it. I don't think it's taking the piss, so to speak, him doing that. If you have a car as good as the RB19 is relative to its rivals, and you have an opportunity to, if you're lucky, achieve unprecedented levels of success in a season, both in terms of winning the number of races and percentage of points, laps led and all these things, you should be going for it. I don't really fault him for that. What I do fault him for is actually pitting to do it. Right. So I wouldn't mind just trying to go for the fastest lap to get the extra point. But the concern that I have with actually pitting again to do it is you're relying on your team to have a good pit stop. Not to be clear, Red Bull does the best pit stops on the grid, both in terms of consistency and also in terms of how fast they are. We got to figure out how they're doing that because they're beating every other team. But in a possible scenario, if they have a slow pit stop, you could lose the lead because you decided to make an unnecessary pit stop for the fastest lap, or worse still, they could fail to fit the tire correctly, and you could retire on the spot, right? So imagine the shock and horror you would have if you have an opportunity as a team to win every single race in the season. I'm saying they're still not going to do it, but it's possible that they could do it. Imagine losing that because you made an unnecessary pit stop and lost the lead because of a problem. However unlikely it is, by choosing to pit, you make it possible. And so that's the situation that I really don't agree with. I don't mind pushing at the end for fastest lap, but I just wouldn't have pitted to do so.
I'd hoped, Bryson, as I saw that whole pit stop on the penultimate lap, or penultimate lap, the last before the third last lap, I'd hoped that the racing gods had had their Weetabix, Bryson, and would make Max and Red Bull pay for what was a very cheeky manoeuvre. Again, if you can do it and you've got the infrastructure and the pit stop crew to get it done, no mistakes, and they do have, then fair play. Like, who am I to be hated that circumstance? But I don't know.
It could have happened. I mean, honestly, they have a great pit stop team, but even they are fallible. You saw what happened in Austin last year.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Okay, let's talk about stewards, because stewards always have to be a part of the conversation, eh? Track limits, Bryson, 1,200 infringements apparently, or 1,200 instances where they were looking at for potentially infringements declared post race, Bryson, on a weekend where a driver in Delano Van Toft had passed away. Do the FIA and the stewards, and again, these two things potentially aren't linked, but potentially there is a dotted line between them. Do the stewards need to sort themselves out, or is that just, is Austria and Spielberg just a track limits, just a bit of an anomalous circumstance?
First of all, let me just say it was incredibly sad to hear about the passing away of Delano, and it's a reminder to all of us that motorsport is inherently dangerous. I will vehemently denounce anyone who ever says that racing is too safe nowadays. Any machine constructed by human hands can be destroyed along with the life that happens to be in it. And so any crash that drivers are able to walk away from or recover from, we should be thankful for. So just a reminder that the drivers are putting their lives on the line each time they go out on the track. But in terms of track limits, I mean, this is a situation, believe it or not, that's been brewing since Bahrain 2021. Now, you remember Bahrain 2021, Lewis and Max had a great fight. It was probably the first indication that we might have a really impressive championship that particular year. But Max was particularly upset with Lewis going wide over and over and over again in turn 4. And the rules at the time said that, well, we're not monitoring track limits at turn 4, but Max, was not happy about that and wanted to, complain about it, as is his right to do. And in a move of, I don't, calling it weakness might be the wrong word, but in a move of ill judgment, the stewards decided mid-race, actually, we are going to monitor track limits at turn number 4, and you're no longer allowed to go across the white line each time. That was a surprise to all of us, given the way that the weekend had unfolded up to that point. But that was his decision. And that whole situation kicked off a chain of events that eventually led to, F1 at the end of that season saying, okay, the white line is going to define the track limits everywhere. Every track, every corner, every session, qualifying, race, practice, everything, the white line defines the limit. Great. That's going to be our track limit from now on. It's no longer going to be an issue, right? Well, in the beauty and simplicity of that simple rule, Formula One failed to realize that they actually don't possess the technology to be able to enforce that rule. And normally that seems like it's not a huge deal, but at Austria, at the Red Bull Ring, and particularly at the final two corners, turns 9 and 10, they're high speed corners, which require a lot of lateral load on the car, a lot of mixed loading as well with braking, and they're off camber, right? And the drivers are having to push incredibly hard to get the tenths and hundredths of a second against their competitors because given how short the lap is, any small tiny error has proportionally a bigger impact. So they're pushing it every single lap, and they're going to go over occasionally. You can't even see the line from the from the position in the cockpit, to know. So they have to actually be able to investigate this. And the problem that we have is with Formula One, yes, there actually are detection loops, and they're called like cheat loop, detection points that can actually identify when a driver is perceived to have gone out of track limits. So it actually changes every track. The problem is there's still a manual review process to look through each one of those and say manually confirm, we're going to give you a track limit violation penalty. And the situation that we find ourselves in is Formula One does not have the technology to have the confidence and the precision available to be able to fully rely on that system automatically, to be able to automatically, tell you when a driver should actually get a penalty by forcing themselves to do this manual review process with CCTV cameras and other tools that they use. They kind of put themselves in a situation where it was farcical what we saw in Austria. We got in a situation where because they required manual intervention, they're relying on the drivers sneakily looking at who's driving in front of them to complain about track limits to their job. But in principle, they should be able to do their job without the aid of the drivers. And what's worse is that Aston Martin's protests, and again, all credit to Aston Martin, they are incredibly tenacious at defending their drivers and their team, and they will go after the FIA the way Mercedes should have, frankly, after Abu Dhabi in 2021. They will go after the FIA and force them to make decisions, and oftentimes they are successful. And in this situation, they're saying, listen, you guys missed situations, missed track limit violations that you should have caught. And they would have been flagged. That 1,200 case number of possible, infringements, that comes from these automatic systems. The problem is they aren't used to directly give the penalties. They're all still checked manually. So fundamentally, the FIA is in a situation where they have to change something. Otherwise, they're going to repeat this every year. They told the Red Bull Ring last year they should add gravel traps to turn 9 and turn 10 to naturally prevent drivers from going out there. The Red Bull Ring decided not to do that because it would make problems for MotoGP. But I think we're in a situation where something has to change. The technology that we really need to make this work would probably be really advanced, kind of like putting sensors in the wheels themselves, kind of like in football, like in the World Cup, some of these high-tech balls have sensors inside of them. We could use something like that for Formula One to develop a system that's both automatic and high precision. So we could actually do this automatically. So trust me, I don't mind people yelling at the FIA for things that I think they've done incorrectly. But in this situation, we really put ourselves in this place as a sport where this could happen. It's very unlikely to happen at other tracks, to be honest. It's just specifically turns 9 and 10 at the Red Bull Ring that makes it very likely.
Oh, Bryson, the FIA, mate. Like, what are we going to do with them again? It's very typically FIA to amend the rules in a way that they can no longer enforce. I don't know. And again, you're right. It is anomalous at the Spielberg Ring, but still, like, this is like the upper echelon of motorsport globally, right? It's farcical, Bryson.
The worst part about it is not even the track limits themselves. It's that by having a manual process and doing what they're doing in the current implementation, it opens the door to inconsistency beyond just the workload problem. Just giving thousands of cases for someone to evaluate, that's bad enough. But by opening the door to inconsistency, you allow yourselves to be influenced duly or unduly by the pressures of the teams themselves and arguably their fan bases. I mean, if you know Fernando Alonso is going to lose points because of something, and you're in the FIA, you might be you might be more reluctant to, let that go when you know how much you're going to hear about it after the fact. I mean, this is just something that we can eliminate all these problems by having it a fully automated system and say, hey, listen, it's not me. I didn't even give you the penalty. The system is robust enough and it works well enough to be able to give it. And you can't blame me if I was the FAA. So
The game is the game. The system is the system. But again, it just it perturbs me every single time, Bryson, that the FIA continue to make these like schoolboy error, like bloody don't implement the rule if you can't enforce it. What are we doing? Inmates running the asylum. Check Perez in front of me. Track limit. Like what? This is absolute chaos, Bryson. Very quickly, mate, before we talk about Silverstone, you touched on something there that, and again, this is not quite a groundswell of thought, but it's getting to that stage. So I had a chat with Mr. Peter Windsor, fellow friend of the channel, the other day, and I pushed to him the F1 over the next couple of months, say the next between now and the end of the season, and potentially longer, depending on how long Red Bull can keep up this dominance for. The F1 will have a problem, and here's why. 1 in 4 of the current viewership have come to F1 via Netflix's Drive to Survive, right? And COVID hiatus, of course, and of course the blood and guts season that was 2021. Now, because of what they're watching, which is, and I get that those were an anomalous circumstance, almost like a holy trinity of an anomalous circumstance. I get that, but now that they're seeing F1 as it is, like let's say 7 or 8 out of 10 of the time, just kind of like one team's got a bit of a jump and it's dominance and stasis. I think, Bryson, is what I'm positing to you, that the FIA, Liberty Media, and the FOM are going to have to do something very, very quickly, a la party mode or whatever else it is, TD04, whatever the directive is. But they're going to have to do something very soon and institute it properly with a view to peg back Red Bull, because I'm sure, I know these are lagging indicators, but when the viewing and attendance figures start coming out between now and over the latter half of the season, year on year, Bryson, I am 100% sure that we're going to see material drop-offs between now and last year. Bryson, I'm positing to you then, mate, that when do the FIA intervene with a view to level out this playing field? Because it's absolutely within their remit and within their scope. Purists won't like it, but I think they're going to have to, with a view to stop the Drive to Survive viewing population going away. So I put it to you like this, Bryson. When do they intervene? I'm guessing that you don't want them to, like me, but when do you think they do?
Don't intervene. I don't care. I don't care. I mean, listen, the Formula One, it's almost like you get into a relationship with someone and you have this perception of who you are, and they like who you are, and you go on a date and everything is going well. And then over time, when you spend more time with them, you find out they're not like that at all. That's not you met a fictitious person. You didn't actually meet the person. And so if a person, loves you, or if you love a sport, you love what it actually is. And Formula One has always done this delicate dance of trying to balance, racing and everything else. But the fact of the matter is, Formula One is not like other sports. It's not like other racing series. There is this fundamental paradox here, and it's an engineering paradox, and that is the closest racing and the best possible competition comes from a single make specification series where everyone has the same car, and the only thing that is different is the drivers themselves or potentially the setups of the cars. But that gives you the great racing. Indy car is a perfect example of that. But that's not what Formula One is. Formula One is a constructors championship. It is just as much a competition between engineers as it is between drivers. Arguably, it's a bigger competition between engineers than it is against drivers. And it has the opportunity to be a true meritocracy in its purest form, where if you just do a better job building a car, you can beat the competition. Now, granted, there are major caveats with Red Bull in terms of just building a better car because of their cost cap infringement and also because of a few other things related to Abu Dhabi as well. But in principle, we can imagine a situation where a team, say Mercedes, just did a better job engineering a car than the competition. Think of like Dash or something else like that in the past, or party modes. And in principle, I really wouldn't want there to be any modification at all. While I understand that as a business, Formula One has to be viable and has to actually make more money than it spends, and that might influence their decision making. But the FIA itself is separate from Formula One in principle. It's supposed to be, and their principal concern should be safety, number one, followed closely by sporting equity and fairness. And then they can talk about some of these other things as well. So, in my view, I'm not so much interested in changing the sport because we think Red Bull specifically is going too fast. I think this is an opportunity for other teams to get faster and also for penalties to be applied even perhaps more aggressively. And I've said several times, if we think that a sliding scale for a CFD development time and wind tunnel time is not an effective enough penalty, and I would argue that it's not, given the way that Red Bull just run away with everything. A better solution could actually be, instead of a sliding scale of CFD and wind tunnel time, or perhaps in addition to that, you could have a sliding scale on what the minimum weight is for the car. So, say for example, you have a team that is, winning the championship. You have the first place team, and you have the last place team, and maybe you have, I'm suggesting, a 5 kilogram difference between the of minimum weight between the fastest car and the slowest car that will actually slow down the fastest car, right? Because you can't precisely measure exactly how much lap time you will lose based on less safety time, less wind tunnel time. You can estimate it, but that can fluctuate wildly depending on how adept and how deft the team is at working their way around the penalties that they're aware of. With a weight penalty, there's no way to escape that. That hurts you from day one. And most importantly, it's very quantifiable. We know that you will lose roughly 3/10 of a second per lap for every 10 kilograms of weight in the car, period. And that will be the case from the first race of the season. So if you want to take steps to adjust this domination of one team, I'm not in favor of mid-season changes. I'm not in favor of, WEC style Le Mans BOP changes that change the horsepower of the cars right before a race. I'm okay with some balance of performance in terms of this sliding scale question, but do it in between seasons and do it based on championship order. So what I would suggest is maybe you can make a modification to the way the sliding scale is actually applied to make things a little bit better. But at the same time, there's two things we have to say. Number one, eliminate Red Bull from the championship for a second. And we're actually seeing one of the best championships in a long time. We're actually
True.
kind of having like echoes of 2012 right now, as far as
True.
drivers trying to figure out who's the number two driver, who's the number two team. It changes every race, as we've been saying, with Ferrari, Aston Martin, and Mercedes. It's just that Red Bull specifically are the outliers. And also Max specifically is the outlier as well. As I said before, Checo is not really giving us the best I think he's capable of. But even so, I think Max has taken a step, and that's also made this much more one sided than it really should be. And so I think the regulations. I know a couple of our mutual friends will probably disagree and say the regulations aren't working, and Red Bull is running away, and therefore it's not working. But there's a little more subtlety involved here, and actually looking up and down the field. We had, Nick De Vries was knocked out of qualifying being only, he was the last car on the grid in qualifying in Austria, and he was 8/10 of a second behind P1. I mean, that is incredible. The entire field was in 1 second in qualifying one. So I just think that things are actually getting closer. That's why the midfield fight's never been closer, and why it's so exciting. But yeah, we can do more in terms of how we write the regulations to make any adjustments, sliding scale adjustments, a little bit more impactful. I think that limiting CFD time and wind tunnel time is not as effective as other possible solutions. And as I offered one for consideration, was to have a variable, basically a weight penalty for success, where it affects you from day one, and there will be some politicking over what that amount of weight should be, and we can discuss that. But fundamentally, I think it's a better strategy than simply limiting CFD time.
Thea, make it happen now, please, because I am a bit concerned for the sport. I suppose I, I masquerade sometimes, Bryson, as a purist, but I'm not. I'm a part-time purist, part-time casual, if I'm honest. So I identify, although I've been watching a gazillion years now, longer than I'd like to remember, I identify with the drive to survive point of view. I do see it that sadly, as much as the mid pack is shuffling up and There are variable changes race on race. Like that is all really, really good. And those are news stories and plot lines that we can cling on to, right, to keep us interested. I just think the TikTok generation, those much younger than myself and much more handsome, that their attention spans are short, Bryson. And so if we want to, if you want as Liberty Media and FOM to take over North America, then the way that North American sports, right, it's fueled off of competition for the places that matter first and second. And if you don't have that, I think Project North America has a big issue as Las Vegas Grand Prix is coming up.
Yeah, I guess my final thoughts on that are I don't really care. I don't really care if people have a false impression of what Formula One is. We can definitely make Formula One better. We can definitely adjust it to uh, 2 or 3 levels removed to make it a little bit closer and to make it a greater competition. But fundamentally, situations can happen where teams dominate. And people will be mad and say, "Well, why aren't you? Don't you want this? Don't you want Red Bull to be pegged back? Pegged back? Aren't you some sort of Lewis Hamilton fanatic and Mercedes fanatic?" The truth is, I mean, I am, but you have to have you have to have. I like these teams. I like them, but I'm a Formula One fan first, I would say. And even if I wasn't, you have to have the foresight and the knowledge to recognize this could turn around easily for some team person X, Y, or Z happens to like. Let's imagine Ferrari goes on an incredible run of success, something they've been wanting for a long time, years in the making. We haven't seen them win a driver championship since 2007, and they just nail it and win, going into tear for 5 years. Are you going to pull back Ferrari now? Because, well, people are getting bored, Ferrari's winning. Oh, Mercedes is winning. Oh, you got to pull. I mean, this can happen sometimes. And part of the fun is watching teams learn from each other and copy each other and find pace. People wonder why Adrian Newey is sneaking around looking at Aston Martin and Williams and Haas and things. It's not just to gloat and say how great his car is. It's because he's learning something. All teams are learning things from all other teams. And when you have this competition, that's a design competition as much as anything else, everyone's getting faster as a result. There's a reason why F1 cars are the fastest cars in the world. It's because they're constantly being reimagined and redesigned. And so that's part of the DNA of the sport in my mind. And yes, we may make some sacrifices occasionally in competitiveness, but I don't have a problem with that personally. We can have discussions about how others feel.
Oh, Bryson, you're a different gravy, sir. I love it. I love the way you articulate, and I mean, F1 fan first, I think is the headline, and I'm there with you too. But I'm still just a tad concerned. Before we get into a Silverstone conversation, I want to. One of the plot lines that I've been clinging onto, Bryson, is the level at which Max Verstappen is driving, because I contended a couple of weeks back with friends that almost every week now he'll do something that I don't think he should be able to do, Bryson. So most notably at the Austrian Grand Prix, it was a very, in the end, in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, the move on Checo Perez was super clumsy. But the fact that it's wet, changeable, full tank of fuel, all that other stuff, the fact that he makes it stick still, Bryson, I'm just like, again, I don't understand. From so far back, Bryson, tell me how he manages to do these things. I'm just clumsy. But
well, Max manages to do those moves that you mentioned because of the complacency of other drivers. Ultimately, now the thing, as I said before, Max has a very specific driver profile, right? Prodigious, metronomic race pace, incredible race pace. He's raised his qualifying game significantly this year. With Monaco GP was a good example of that. But the way he races is just it's bullying to a degree. And that requires knowledge of who you're racing against, fundamentally. If Checo decided to completely turn in, despite Max being there, I mean, Max pulled a Nico Rosberg 2016, essentially, into turn 3. And it requires a bit of understanding from the person you're doing that against to not have a collision. We saw Nico collided with Lewis in that particular case and broke his front wing and almost had to retire because of it. I mean, it only takes one or two people to say, I'm not going to get out of your way in the situation, and they're going to have a collision. And so that's not really a concern right now because Max seems to be, he clearly has the fastest car, and people tend to not want to fight him currently because they just want to get as best of a position that they can. But you have to wonder what's going to happen at the point when someone will say, no, I've actually had enough of this. And you say it's that you're impressed that he kept it on the black stuff when he was overtaking Sergio Perez. And I would say that's great. He managed to keep it in there, but there are ways in which that could have been raced a bit more fairly with Sergio. Now, of course, he was upset with Sergio for slightly forcing him off the grass, right?
2016
on the run,
Spain, Mercedes.
Well, just on the run down to turn 3, Max went halfway on the grass and thought that could have been a really big collision if that had gone differently. And he's probably right. But the question is, how do you respond to that? It wouldn't have made a difference in the course of the race because Max had the pace to win regardless. I mean, he won by 30 seconds, as we mentioned before, or he would have won without that pit stop. But let's not forget, he didn't even have the right strategy. He didn't even use the optimal strategy, arguably, that would be in reaction to people behind him pitting. He just said, "No, I'm just going to keep going. It's not going to be a problem. I'll give up track position temporarily, but I'll just pass you later on." I mean, his combination of him and the car has the pace to do that. The only thing that really is holding him back, I would argue, is this reactionary, reflexive retaliation that can happen occasionally when he's racing, and his general tendency to race in a way that compromises him if someone decides to fight him back. I think that's the thing that really needs to be improved going forward. If he wants to, I mean, look, let's be totally clear. Senna, Schumacher were just as egregious in multiple situations.
Yes.
No one's arguing that. And perhaps we've been spoiled by the way Lewis Hamilton will allow you to race him cleanly, if you decide you want to. Max is not that kind of a driver, and maybe we shouldn't expect him to be that way. Your driving is based on what the stewards will punish and what they will not punish. It's just my own personal preference. I like to see cars going side by side for 2 and 3 corners, giving each other space. That's what I want to see. Even if in the regulations he's not committing any crimes, any particular felonies or anything. Personally, that's what I'd like to see. Is a bit more racing.
Yeah, me too, Bryson. I would like to see. I think somebody needs the bloody car, though, right? The car and the gumption to go wheel to wheel with this guy for a series of corners, and nobody has both, right? At the moment, Checo has one, but not the other.
Yeah, I think when the time comes, Mercedes is actually going to be the team that puts a stop to this. Not only because of the specific history with Lewis and Max from 2021, but they've been building their cars to be very robust recently. I mean, you saw George Russell's crash at turn 9 in Canada when he had a collision with the wall. I would argue the wall was more injured than he was in his car. I mean, what are they making that rear suspension out of? And so I think that there will come a time when Mercedes has produced a competitive car. We don't know when that will be, if it will be 2024 or the next year or what have you. But in a situation where Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen go wheel to wheel, Lewis has an entire year of experience backing out of moves with Max. And so I imagine if the situation comes up again and they're both fighting for the win, there will not be quarter given, and we'll see how it unfolds.
Speaking of which, Bryson, my memory casts back to 2021 Silverstone Grand Prix. And again, probably one of the greatest opening laps of any F1 race I've ever seen. What are you? Yeah, you can argue it. You can argue it back. Debatable.
We're moving on. We're moving on.
Another conversation for another day. What are you looking forward to this weekend, aside from you talk about upgrades, right? But what are the plot lines that you're keen to see and will be dialing in for this weekend at the Silverstone Grand Prix, Bryson?
Well, you kind of hit upon it yourself a little bit earlier when you said that Mercedes does incredibly well at Barcelona in general. They just tend to set up a car, design a car that handles mid to high speed corners well. Silverstone is very much like that. It very much is a situation where the weaknesses and rear instabilities that Mercedes tends to have in their car is not going to be an issue for them typically at Silverstone. And so I would argue that they're going to be just as competitive at Silverstone as they were at Barcelona, probably more competitive, given the scale of the upgrades that they're actually bringing. Now, again, to be clear, you can't bolt on upgrades like it's a video game and go 3 tenths faster. That's not always guaranteed, but it's not a sprint weekend to have more practice sessions to dial in the setup and to actually figure out what the window they need to get the car to produce performance. But potentially, this could be Mercedes' most competitive weekend of the entire year because of the factors that I mentioned in terms of the upgrades and the way that they typically design their cars to perform well on certain types of circuits. And it's a race weekend where other teams will also bring upgrades, but they're not going to be as significant as the Mercedes upgrade. This was what my understanding is. Ferrari's bringing some things, new floor, new suspension bits, and it's essentially, I'm assuming every team is bringing something, unless they tell me they're not. But the scale of that upgrade actually could be a various there are levels that you could actually have there. McLaren will be bringing a new livery, which tries to harken back to the glory days of 2007, 2008. They didn't really do that correctly, I would argue. I think that the design they chose has some potential, but they really wanted to keep a lot of papaya in the design that I think kind of throws it off for me personally. Looks more like Racing Point circa 2015 than anything else, or Force India. It was Force India back then. Sorry, it was Force India. But fundamentally, no, I believe that the major storyline from Silverstone will be the rebound weekend for Mercedes, being able to actually be much more competitive. And as gloomy and dour as the Austrian GP was, I think the Silverstone GP could actually be very competitive for them. The other question is Ferrari, actually. Everyone kind of had written off Ferrari for the past few races, saying, well, they just haven't really gotten it together. Their upgrade didn't really work as much as it should have, et cetera, et cetera. But they've demonstrated it in Austria that they always have the potential to get it right on a weekend. And when they do, they're very competitive. So you can't take for granted that there won't be any competition besides Red Bull. There's going to be several teams fighting. And the upgrade that McLaren brought for Austria, it actually it evokes much more of an Aston Martin philosophy than Red Bull, but it seemed to really be powerful and working for Lando Norris, although he's always good in Austria. But I think that McLaren is going to be up there as well. I think this is just more evidence that the regulations can work and they are working, but there's just more than one data point. You can't look at just one team, look at all the teams as sort of a constellation, and there's plenty of fighting to be had. So it should be interesting.
Oh, here's hoping, Bryson. The money that I would give for another through goes Hamilton moment. Just something for me to clutch onto, eh?
There is one more wild card I want to make sure I mention. As you may remember, a famous race in Silverstone 2020 that Lewis Hamilton won on 3 tires was a very incredible and amazing opportunity. But let's not forget, tires aren't supposed to disintegrate. Okay, that's not how that's supposed to work. And fundamentally, Silverstone has one of the highest loadings of the front left of any circuit on the calendar. It puts extreme loads into the tires, and if the cars are at a higher performance level than Pirelli expected, it can put them in a vulnerable position. The final wild card effectively is this is the first weekend that Pirelli is bringing their new tires. Okay, these were actually supposed to be the 2024 tires, but because teams were so far ahead of the curve in terms of performance, they brought them forward 6 months and are racing them now because this is a circuit that they're most vulnerable at. Now, Pirelli has made every effort to have no changes to performance as a result of changing the tire compounds and it's not even the compound. It's actually the construction of the tire. It's actually different because compound versus construction is a separate thing we can talk about, but it's not going to make the tires wear less. It's going to keep them from disintegrating. But fundamentally, even if you don't want there to be any kind of performance change, there's going to be some kind of performance difference, and different teams may have more success or less success extracting the maximum out of these new tires. And who knows, maybe that could make it difficult for Red Bull, make it better for Aston Martin or some other team. And so that is another variable that can switch things up a bit beyond all the upgrades, beyond the inherent track characteristics suiting Mercedes better. the final factor is tires. They could actually make things very interesting.
Here's hoping, Bryson. Anything, mate. Anything that I can clutch onto to level up the competition. But even then, I just think I can't see the Achilles heels. The Achilles heel, even in that RB19, they don't eat tires like a Ferrari. Do you know what I mean? There's just nothing to give me any hope. It's a joke.
That's what the one weird thing about that car is. It's just good everywhere. They just haven't had. I mean, their bad, quote unquote, bad weekend. They only won by 10 seconds instead of 30 seconds.
It's
You know?
daft.
So it's been a very impressive car, no question.
Oh my god, they're incredible, man. If I put on my engineering cap for a second, you've got to admire what they've done, eh? You just have to. I'm in awe of them. I'm in awe of them, their team and their pit crew, the drive, like
Everything that I've seen. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say everything that I've seen that's revolutionary or an improvement or something that will make the competitors' cars better. Their new floor design has these nooks and crannies and backward-facing steps and all kinds of things. Or they have a front suspension that has anti-dive now, and they have these factors. Or they're trying to work on their DRS to make it more efficient and install the diffuser, the beaming as well. These are things that Red Bull did first, and they did them right from the beginning, making the side pods wider and downwashing. These are things that Red Bull got right from the beginning. So, regardless of the caveats of cost cap infringements and other things, the actual physical car that they've built is pretty spectacular. And there's nothing that you can really do to take all that away from them.
Yeah, absolutely, Bryson. Very well said. When they hoisted Checo Perez's car up onto that crane at Monaco, it just looked like Megatron, like 3D from all angles, brother. I was just like, what are we looking at here? This is like something from the future. Bloody no, like Terminator and Skynet. But hey, mate, you've been an absolute legend. More than generous with your time, as always, Mr. Sullivan. Bryson Sullivan, you can catch one of the goatiest goats that's ever goated in F1, an aerodynamic whiz, and an absolute, more to the point, and I want to give Bryson some credit here, more to the point, a different tier of communication and elocution, and that's why so many people gravitate to at Natural Paradigm on Twitter, so that they can learn and understand about a bit about anti-dive and flow vias and aero more generally, because I don't know anyone else that does it as good as you. So got to give you some flowers, bro.
Yeah, the community has been very positive in terms of me learning things as well and being able to communicate things with others. I love getting tagged in all kinds of tweets and posts saying, "Look at this vortex, look at this pattern, look at this airflow." People know that I enjoy that type of stuff, so I appreciate that reception in the community. I'm hoping to be around as much as I can. I was pretty inactive the past week, but I'll try to be a little bit more active in the upcoming races.
Yeah, absolutely, bro. The community needs you. And if ever there were an F1 space to end all F1 spaces, that space would be the space of Mr. Bryson Sullivan at Natural Paradigm on Twitter. There you go. Done it. Bro, you're an absolute legend. Thank you so much for your time again. Do me a favor, guys. If you're watching the video on YouTube, that is all that I ask. If you're listening on a podcasting platform, do me a favor, scroll to the top, drop 5 stars. We are going purple sectors only for 2023. Mr. Sullivan, you're an absolute legend as always. Anytime you're ready to come back on, I will happily chop it up with you on all things F1 and defer to your infinite expertise. Guys and girls, thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you as always, same time, same place next week. Between now and then, do me a favor, look but never stare. Peace.